My son showed up at my door at 7:20 on a Tuesday morning in November, still wearing his work clothes from the day before. He had a duffel bag over one shoulder and his daughter asleep against the other. Her cheek pressed into his neck, her little boots still on. He hadn't called ahead. He hadn't needed to. I'd been expecting this morning for 14 months. I didn't say anything when I opened the door. I just stepped back and let him in. He sat down at my kitchen table the way a man sits when he's not sure his legs will hold him much longer. He set his daughter, my granddaughter Ivy, down on the couch in the next room, tucked the throw blanket around her, and came back. I poured coffee. He stared at the table. Outside, the first real snow of the season was coming down over Waterloo, soft and indifferent to everything happening inside this house. He changed the locks, he said. Both doors. The garage code doesn't work either. I nodded. Dad. He looked at me. How are you not surprised? I told him I'd explain everything. I told him to drink his coffee first. He didn't. He just kept looking at me with that expression I hadn't seen since he was 9 years old, and found out the world wasn't quite the shape he'd thought it was. But let me back up, because this story doesn't start at my kitchen table. It starts 3 years earlier in a restaurant in downtown Kitchener where a man named Philip Okafor shook my hand for the first time and smiled like he was doing me a favor. My name is Hugh Mercer. I'm 64 years old, recently retired from 28 years as a civil engineer with the region of Waterloo, and I raised my son Lachlan on my own, after his mother Diane passed from a brain aneurysm when he was 14. I want you to know that because it shapes everything about what follows. Lachlan and I, we're the kind of people who fix things quietly and don't ask for much. He became a secondary school geography teacher in Cambridge, coached cross-country, wrote thank you notes by hand. If you want to know the shape of a person, look at what they're willing to be underpaid to do. He met Amara Okafor at a professional development conference in Guelph. She taught special education at a school in Mississauga, and she is a genuinely warm person. She remembered the name of his late mother within the first hour of knowing him. She asked questions that meant something. Lachlan called me that night and I could hear something different in his voice. A lightness I hadn't heard in a long time. They dated for a year and a half before he brought her home to Waterloo. I liked her immediately. But I want to be honest with you. Even on that first visit, even before I'd met her father, something in me went quiet and watchful the way it does when you're inspecting a structure and you can't yet locate the source of a sound you shouldn't be hearing. I met Philip Okafor at dinner 3 weeks later. He owns a mid-sized commercial real estate development company based out of Mississauga, Okafor Properties, with holdings in several GTA suburbs. His name is on a parking garage on Hurontario and 2 mixed-use builds near Oakville that you'd recognize if you drove past them. He's not a household name, but in certain rooms in the Greater Toronto area, he is the room. He was gracious at dinner, attentive. He asked about my engineering background with what looked like genuine curiosity. But there was a quality to the way he held himself that I filed away and didn't quite name that night. He looked at my house the way an appraiser looks at a property he's already mentally discounted. Not cruelly. Not even consciously, perhaps. Just with the quiet certainty of a man who has been comfortable long enough to forget what it felt like not to be. He gave a toast at their wedding 14 months later. 70 guests, a restored heritage farmhouse venue outside of Hamilton. Tasteful and expensive. The toast was about Amara. But really it was about what Amara represented, the continuation of something he'd built, the legacy of values he'd instilled, the standards he'd worked 40 years to establish. He said it warmly, he said it with love. But underneath every sentence, if you listened carefully, was the faintest pressure, the kind that doesn't bruise but accumulates. I drove home alone that night and sat in my driveway for a while before I went inside. I wrote the date in a notebook I kept on my desk. That was the first entry in what would become a 14-month record of everything I noticed and couldn't yet say out loud. The first thing I noticed was the house. Philip had offered them what he called a wedding gift. A semi-detached in a newer subdivision in Oakville, fully furnished, move-in ready. Lachlan mentioned it like it was the most generous thing he'd ever witnessed. I asked if the property was in both their names. He paused. I think it's through one of Dad's holding companies for now, tax purposes. He said he'd sort the deed transfer out. I said that sounded reasonable. I said nothing else. The second thing I noticed was the job offer. About 7 months into the marriage, Philip approached Lachlan about leaving teaching to work as a community liaison for Okafor Properties. The role involved attending consultations, meeting with neighborhood associations, representing the company's development projects at planning meetings. In other words, Philip wanted a well-liked, trustworthy face, someone people instinctively believed, to stand in front of projects that needed goodwill. It's double what I make at the school board, Lachlan told me over the phone. Maybe more. I asked what Amara thought. She thinks it's a great opportunity. I asked what he thought. He said he was thinking about it. He took it 6 weeks later. I visited him at the Okafor Properties office in Mississauga on a Friday afternoon. Glass and steel, a view of the 403, a desk that was clearly meant to signal arrival. Lachlan wore a collared shirt I didn't recognize. He was proud and I was proud of him for being proud. But I kept thinking about the phrase one of my old project managers used to use. When a contractor gives you something for free up front, check the change order clause at the back of the contract. I called my neighbor Roy that same evening. Roy spent 31 years practicing employment law in Ontario before he retired to the house next door to mine, where he now grows heirloom tomatoes and reads too much. We've been splitting a cord of firewood together every October for a decade. I told him what I knew. He got quiet. Does Lachlan have an employment contract? He asked. I didn't know. I called Lachlan the next morning and asked casually. There was no formal contract. He was classified as an independent contractor, month to month. More flexibility, Philip had told him. Better for both of us. Roy looked at me over his fence the next morning. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. That was the morning I started keeping detailed notes. I want to stop here and say something to you directly. If you have ever sat with the knowledge that someone you love is walking into a trap, and understood that saying so would only make them defend the person who said it, then you know the exact quality of silence I'm describing. It is not passive. It is the hardest kind of active. You carry the weight of knowing and you carry it alone because the alternative is worse. I carried it for a long time. 4 months into the notebook, Amara came to my house alone. That had never happened before. I made tea and she sat across from me at this same kitchen table and she was quiet for a while before she spoke. Hugh, she said, I need you to know that I love Lachlan. I told her I knew that, and I love Ivy. She looked down at her cup, but my father has very specific ideas about how things should go. About the kind of life Ivy should have, the right schools, the right neighborhood. He uses the word foundation a lot. She paused. He thinks Lachlan is a good man. He just doesn't think Lachlan is. She stopped. Isn't what? I asked. She didn't finish the sentence. She finished her tea and left 40 minutes later, and she held on to the hug at the door longer than she ever had before. I stood in my kitchen after the door clicked shut and didn't move for a long time. That night I called Roy, and then I did something I had never in my life expected to do. I hired a private investigator, a woman named Janet Howe, who Roy had worked alongside years ago in a civil matter and trusted completely. Quiet, methodical, patient. I asked her to look at the financial structure connecting my son to Philip Okafor. What she found went considerably further than what I'd been afraid of. The house in Oakville was registered to an Ontario-numbered company, 2847391 Ontario Inc., which was controlled by a family trust Philip administered. Lachlan's name was nowhere on title. Philip had described it as a gift and had simply never transferred anything. The deed was exactly as it had been the day he'd handed them the keys. The compensation structure was worse. Because Lachlan was classified as a contractor through a second numbered company, he had no access to the protections a standard employee relationship provides in Ontario. No entitlement to reasonable notice under the Employment Standards Act, no severance baseline, no record of employment. Philip could end the arrangement on 30 days written notice, and there was no recourse that would hold up in any meaningful way. And there was the issue Roy had identified with the cohabitation and marriage contract. A document Philip's family lawyer had prepared before the wedding, and recommended Lachlan sign with a lawyer of his own choosing. Except the lawyer Philip recommended was a man who had done work for Okafor Properties for 11 years. That relationship was never once disclosed to Lachlan before he signed. Roy reviewed that agreement on a Thursday afternoon at my kitchen table. He read it twice. He set it down and looked at me over his reading glasses. This is not standard, he said. This is almost entirely one-sided. I thought about the toast at the wedding. I thought about the word foundation and the faint weight Philip had put on it. Then I have to tell you about the part that changed everything for me. Not the house, not the contract. This is the part I sat with for 4 days before I could even begin to think clearly. In the course of her work, Janet spoke with a former colleague of Amara's, a woman who had left the same school board and had no reason to protect anyone. This woman told Janet that during a difficult period in the marriage, Amara had confided in her that she wasn't certain Lachlan was Ivy's biological father. I read that in Janet's report on a Wednesday morning. I closed the folder. I got up and walked around my block twice in the November cold without a coat. I came back inside and read it again. I sat with it for 4 days. I didn't call anyone. I didn't write anything in the notebook. I just held it. Then I built a plan. I told Lachlan I'd been meaning to put together a proper family health history. Something I'd been putting off since Diane passed. Something her illness had made me realize I shouldn't keep delaying. I said I wanted to gather blood types and some basic genetic information, and I'd love to include Ivy's as part of it. I found a mail-in kit. I made it feel like a project, a grandfather's project, something warm and intentional. He thought it was a beautiful idea. One of Ivy's cheek swabs, taken on a weekend she'd stayed with me, a weekend she'd named Grandpa Camp because we made bannock and watched old nature documentaries. I sent to a private laboratory in Toronto separately, with no accompanying explanation. The results came back on a Friday. I read the envelope once. I put it in the drawer in my desk beneath the notebook. Lachlan was not Ivy's biological father. I want to be completely honest with you about what happened next. Nothing. I made no call. I gave no sign. I sat with the heaviest document I have ever held in my hands. And instead of thinking about lawyers or confrontations or justice, I thought about a 2-year-old who called me Grandpa Hugh, who put maple syrup on scrambled eggs because she'd seen me do it once, and who was genuinely frightened of the automatic hand dryers in public washrooms. I thought about what she needed. Then I started building. Roy helped me find Lachlan a real lawyer, someone with no connection to Philip Okafor or anyone in his orbit. Her name was Sylvia Brandt, a civil litigator in Hamilton with 22 years of practice and a manner that was composed and exact. I paid the retainer myself from savings I'd been keeping since before Diane died, money I'd always meant to be his eventually anyway. We documented the structure of everything, the numbered company holding the house, the contractor arrangement and what it meant under Ontario law, the marriage contract and the undisclosed relationship between Philip's recommended lawyer and the Okafor family. Janet kept working. She found 2 former Okafor Properties employees who had been pushed out under arrangements that looked, on paper, nearly identical to what was being constructed around my son. I called them both. One of them, a man named Terry who had managed Okafor's Oakville properties for almost a decade, said something I wrote down exactly as he said it. "He doesn't fire you," Terry told me. "He just makes your position smaller and smaller until you decide to leave. Then he tells everyone it was your choice. And there's nothing anywhere to prove otherwise." I looked at what I'd written and I thought about my son in his borrowed office with his borrowed title, living in a house that was never once in his name. Something in me went very still. I didn't tell Lachlan any of it. Not because I didn't trust him. I trust him completely. But I knew him. He would have gone straight to Philip. He would have asked for an explanation, demanded answers, handed over every advantage we had. And Philip's lawyers would have had a clean, polished response ready inside of 24 hours. I'd watched that man move in rooms. He was never caught without a prepared position. I needed him caught without one. So I waited. And I want to tell you honestly, waiting when you love someone and you can see what's bearing down on them is the hardest discipline I've ever practiced. It is not patience. It is something more precise than patience. It is holding a plan steady while everything human in you is screaming to act. The morning came on a Tuesday in November. Lachlan called me at just after 7. His voice was flat in the way a voice goes when a man is keeping himself together by force of will alone. "Dad, he terminated my contract. He called me last night, said the arrangement was ending, that the company was restructuring its community engagement approach. I went to the office this morning and my keycard didn't work. I drove to the house and the locks were changed. Both of them. The garage code doesn't work. I don't." He stopped. "Ivy's inside with Amara. She texted me and said I should take some space, that things have become complicated. Dad, she sounded like she was reading off something someone else had written." "Where are you right now?" I asked. "In the driveway. Is Ivy with Amara? Is she safe?" "Yes. She doesn't know anything's wrong. She was still asleep when I left." "Okay," I said. "There's a lawyer's name in your phone under B. Sylvia Brandt. Call her right now. Tell her it's time. Then come here." Silence on the line. "Dad, I don't have a lawyer." "What are you?" "I put her number there 6 months ago," I said. "Call her. Then come home." A long silence and then, "You knew. Come home, son." He sat at my table for a while after he arrived. I put coffee in front of him and let the quiet hold. Ivy was still asleep on the couch. The snow was still coming down. When he was ready, I sat across from him and I started at the beginning. I told him everything. The notebook. Janet's findings. The numbered company holding the house. The contractor arrangement and what Roy had explained it meant under Ontario law. The marriage contract and the lawyer who had worked for Philip for 11 years without ever telling my son. I set the folders down one at a time and let him read each one. When I got to the laboratory report, I stopped. "There's one more thing," I said, "and I need you to hear it before you say anything." He looked at me. I slid the envelope across the table. "I want you to slow down with me here, because this is the moment everything in 14 months had been building toward, and it deserves to be lived second by second." He picked it up. His hands weren't steady and he was doing his best not to show that. The kitchen was so quiet I could hear the furnace cycling on in the basement. and the sound of Ivy breathing from the next room, and my own heartbeat in my ears. He opened it. He read it. He read it again, the way you read something a second time when your mind refuses to accept it the first. The color left his face. He set the paper down with the careful, deliberate movements of a man who no longer fully trusts his hands. He didn't say anything for a long time. Outside, a snowplow went by on the street. Somewhere a dog barked twice. Inside this kitchen, neither of us breathed. "She's not mine," he said. It wasn't a question. "Biologically," I said, "that is the only way in which she is not yours. In every other way that has ever mattered, she is yours. She has always been yours. And that does not change because of what that page says. Not if I have anything to say about it." He pressed the heels of both hands into his eyes. His shoulders moved once. He didn't make a sound. I let him sit in it. I didn't reach for him and I didn't fill the silence, because some grief has to be allowed to land before a person can stand up under its weight. The furnace cycled off. The snow kept falling. Time did the thing it does at certain moments. It stretched wide enough to hold more pain than a second should reasonably contain. Then, slowly, he lowered his hands. His eyes were red and clear at the same time. And I watched my son, in real time in front of me, decide who he was going to be in response to the largest thing that had ever happened to him. "What do we do?" he said. "We already started," I told him. "I'll be honest with you. I don't know that I'd have found my feet that quickly. I don't know that I would have moved from the devastation to the question that fast. But that's what you pour into a child, all those years. You pour and you don't know what's load-bearing until the weight finally comes." His were. Sylvia filed the first documents the following Monday. The core of what she argued was straightforward, even if the groundwork behind it was not. Under Ontario law, a property held in trust with a demonstrable intent to transfer, supported by written communication from Philip describing the house as a gift, supported by Lackland's reasonable reliance on that representation over nearly 3 years, created enforceable rights. The contractor arrangement, once reviewed against the actual nature of the work relationship, supported a claim for dependent contractor status, which carries notice entitlements under Ontario common law that Philip's month-to-month framing had been designed to erase. And the marriage contract, signed under conditions that included undisclosed conflicts of interest, had serious validity problems. Philip's legal team responded inside 48 hours. They were good. They had clearly anticipated some version of this. What they had not anticipated was the scope. Janet had been thorough. Terry came forward with his own records. Emails, termination letters, a careful log he'd kept in a folder on his computer since the week he left. His experience mirrored Lauchlan's so precisely it established something courts care about. Pattern. And then there was what Amara did. I will not speak about her with anything other than respect, because I think what she did cost her more than anyone outside that family will ever know. She had been raised by a man who had never once asked whether her choices served her rather than him. She had loved Lackland. I believe she still loves him. But when she finally understood the full extent of what had been constructed around her husband and around her daughter, she made a decision. She called Sylvia Brandt's office on her own. No prompting, no negotiation. She provided documentation confirming the deed structure and the nature of the contractor arrangement. And she confirmed, in a formal statement, the truth about Ivy's biological paternity. Something she had carried alone for nearly 3 years. I don't know what it took to make that call. I know what it meant for us. The settlement took 5 months. Some of the terms are sealed and I'll respect that here. What I can tell you is what the outcome was. The Oakville property was transferred into Lauchland's name. The legal framework Philip had constructed to protect himself was, correctly and thoroughly, used against him. The trust structure that was meant to shield the asset became the very mechanism through which the transfer was enforced. The compensation claims were settled. Lauchland's finances were restored, with legal costs included. The marriage contract was set aside entirely. Philip didn't face criminal charges. What he did was structured carefully enough to stay on the civil side of things, and I'm not naive about what resources can achieve in that regard. But 2 institutional investors who had been in preliminary discussions with Okafor Properties for a mixed-use development in Burlington, once the pattern of how Philip managed people inside his structure became visible through the proceedings, quietly withdrew. A rezoning application he'd spent the better part of 2 years building support for stalled at the municipal level. When 3 community representatives who had worked with Lauchland came to understand how that relationship had actually functioned, the name stopped opening every door it used to open. I'll take that. This is where I owe you something honest, because I think you came here for more than the ending. What this whole thing taught me is that the most effective kind of control rarely raises its voice. It gives gifts. It offers opportunity. It builds the situation one comfortable piece at a time, and by the time you understand the shape of what's been constructed around you, you're already inside it. The people who do this don't think of themselves as controlling. They think of themselves as providing. There is a category of person who has been powerful long enough to lose the distinction between care and possession, and everyone in proximity to them absorbs the cost. What Amara understood in the end, that no one else in her family did, is that protecting your child sometimes means standing against the person who raised you. So here is something concrete you can do today. If someone has put your name on a lease, a job, a home, a future, read the paperwork, all of it. Find someone who has no relationship to the person who handed you the pen and ask them to read it too. Love and documentation are not the same thing, and the people who tell you not to worry about the difference are usually the ones who benefit from your not looking. And here's the question I'd like you to sit with after this is over. If everything that makes you feel secure right now is held in someone else's name, how free are you actually? Ivy turned 3 in January. We had her birthday here in this house because Lachlan's been with me while he figures out the next thing. She wanted to be a polar bear for her party, which meant I spent 45 minutes helping her draw polar bears on construction paper with silver marker, while she gave me very specific instructions I was not following correctly. Lachlan stood in the doorway watching us, and his face held the particular expression of a person who is doing the slow work of allowing a new shape for a thing they thought they understood. He is doing that work honestly. He picks up Ivy every second day. He reads to her every night. It's his time. He has not missed once. People ask me sometimes whether I feel guilty for the months I kept him in the dark. I don't have a clean answer to that. What I know is this. If I had told him early from shock and feeling rather than from preparation, he would have walked into a confrontation with nothing. No documents, no lawyers, no established pattern, no record. He would have walked away with nothing. What I built took time and silence and the discipline to hold a plan in place while everything in me wanted to act. Was it right to let my own son not know? I'm still not certain. But here's what I am certain of. The morning he sat across from me and asked what we do next. That was not a man who had been protected by ignorance. That was a man who had been given the only thing that was ever going to be enough. A foundation that was actually his. Before you go, I want to hear from you, because I read everything you write and your responses are why I keep telling these stories. Tell me honestly, do you think I made the right call keeping him in the dark while I built all of this? Leave me a comment. Number 1, if you think protecting someone in silence is sometimes the only real way to protect them. Number 2, if you believe a parent owes their child the truth the moment they have it, no matter the cost. Number 3, if you're somewhere in the middle and still thinking it through. And while you're down there, tell me where in Canada you're watching from and what time it is. I love knowing how far these stories go. If someone in your life has ever used money or position to make you feel like your place in your own family was something that could be revoked, tell me about it. You are not as alone in that as you feel right now. If this story meant something to you, subscribe before you go. It's a small thing that keeps this going. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully reimagined for original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is entirely coincidental.